So this is our entity representational diagram for our job search application. So you can see we have the user schema right here that will contain the information for the user. We also have the company schema, right, that will store like company details. And then we also have a category, right, where that will show us where a vacancy belongs, right, if it belongs to a certain category, right. We also have the application, right. So our mobile application will allow users to send application to different companies, right. And user will also have their resume, right. As you can see, we have the resume schema that is responsible for storing the resume details of a specific user. And then the application is going to store like the resume, and then the user, company, and then it will also show if the user's application has been accepted or not. And then we have the vacancy schema, right? That's going to store like our job vacancies for a certain company, right? And then we also have the favorite schema, right? So if a user wants to add a certain vacancy to favorite, it will be stored inside our favorite schema, right? So without wasting much of the time, let's start working on our backend, right? So let's start working on our backend. So let me just open my Visual Studio Code, and then let's start working on our backend. So now I'm just going to add a few folders, right? So we have the model folder, and then we also have a middleware, right? The middleware folder, and we also have the controller folder, right? We also have controller folder, and then we also have the routes folder, right? Routes folder, right? So basically, I'm just going to explain this folder structure right here. So the model just represents how our data in the database is going to look like, right? For example, in the user model, it's going to represent how the user data is going to look like inside our database. Also have the controller. So the controller is responsible for accepting requests and also making responses to our client side, right? And then we have the route folder. So what routes do is the routes expose our backend system, our API, to the outside world. When I mean to the outside world, in this case, it's going to expose it to our Flutter mobile application that we are going to be developing, right? So without wasting much of the time, let's create the user model, right? So I'm just going to create a user model.js, right? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create this constant variable mongoose, right? And then we are just going to import the mongoose variable, mongoose, right here. And then we need to create a user schema, right? So a schema is just going to represent how our data is going to look inside our MongoDB, right? So we're going to use mongoose to schema, right? And then the first thing that we need, our first field, is going to be the username, right? The username is going to be of type string, right? It's going to be of type string required. Yes, we need it. So we need to make sure that required is set to true. And then, is it going to be unique? Yes, we also need it to be unique. So unique is also going to be true, right? And then the next one that we need is the email, right? The user's email, right? So the email, the type is going to be a string, right? Is it required? Yes, it's going to be required. And also it's going to be unique, right? The next one is going to be first name. So the first name type is going to be string. So first name, it doesn't need to be unique because we can have multiple users that have the same name, right? And then we also have last name, the user's last name right here. last name. Okay, and then we also have the verification field. So verification is going to be a type of Boolean, and then default is going to be false, because by default a user is not verified unless they verify themselves. Okay, so default is just going to be false. And then we are also here going to have like phone number. So let's just phone number is going to be a string. Phone number is going to be type string, and then default, let's just put a default value, right? So the default value for the phone number, let's just say 1234. That's our default. And then we are also going to have like the user type variable, right? So user type variable, it's also going to be of type string, and then required also is true, and then the default value is going to be user, and then it's going to be an enum, right? Because we are going to represent multiple values, right? We have the user, admin, and then the third one is going to be a hiring company. Okay, so the next field that we need is a profile image. It's just going to display the user's profile, right? So it's going to be of type string. And then also have password. Password is going to be of type string, and then is it going to be required? Yes, we need to require it. It's required, right? And then after this, what we are going to do is we are just going to use to do certain transformation to our MongoDB schema, right? So we are just going to use the toJSON method, right? toJSON method, and then what we are just going to do is we are just going to use a transform function, because we need to do some certain transformations, right? This transform function is going to take in our document and then our return statement, right? And then what we are just going to do is we need to return user. We need to return user ID, right? Which we are going to set into the one that MongoDB gives us, the default that MongoDB gives us, right? Which is underscore ID.toString. Let's just convert it to a string, right? ToString, like this, right? And then after this, what we basically going to do is we are just going to delete the default ID that MongoDB gives us, and then we are just going also to delete return _v, this variable that MongoDB gives us, right? So it's supposed to be double underscore, right? Okay, so now we are done creating our MongoDB schema, right? We are done creating our MongoDB schema, right? So for us to use it, also what we need to do is we are just going to say module.exports is equals to mongoose dot model, and then our model is going to be user, and then we are just going to pass in user schema, right? Like this. Okay. I'm just going to pass in what our user schema like this, right? So now if we move on to our controller, right? Now if we move on to our controller, what we are just going to do is we are just going to work on the logging new user and registering users, right? So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to create user auth controller.js, right? So first we need to initialize our user schema, right? So let's utilize our user schema, which is called to require model the user model like this. Okay, and then we also need to initialize JWT, which is our JSON Web Token. JSON Web Token. And then we need bcrypt for encrypting our password, right? So what I'm just going to do is we didn't install bcrypt, so I'm just going to install bcrypt. All right, so now we are installing bcrypt, right? So before we start working on our model, right, what we're just going to do here is I'm just going to explain what is JSON Web Token, right? A JSON Web Token. So this is a JSON Web Token. So JSON Web Token are just used to authenticate users, right? For them, and we also use them to restrict certain resources from users, right? If we want to protect certain resources so that they are not used by users who are not authenticated, we use what we call a JSON Web Token, right? So a JSON Web Token contains a header. So this header, it specifies the token type and the signing algorithm. Okay, so we have the header on the JSON Web Token, and then what we call the payload, right? So the payload, it contains the claims, which are statements about the user. For example, to the user's email, username, maybe first name, last name, and also additional metadata, right? And then the last item is the signature, right? So the signature, what basically the signature is a signature is just created by encoding the header and the payload that we talked about in the previous year. It's just that's the signature. It's created by encoding these two, the header and also the payload, right? So, and then basically, how does JSON Web Tokens work, right? So for example, on our application that we are going to create, right? The user authenticated. When our user is authenticated, that means if our user logs in, right, the server then generates a JWT, a JSON Web Token, right? So this JSON Web Token is sent to the client and then is stored often maybe in local storage or HTTP cookies, right? In this case, we are going to be storing it into our local storage. We are going to be using shared preferences in Flutter, right? We'll see when we move on to the front-end side, right? So the client includes the token in the HTTP authorization header for request. For example, if you want to request a resource that restricted, right? In our header, we have to put in the authorization with our JWT, right? To tell our server that, okay, we have the right to access this resource, right? And then the server will then validate the token to see if it's valid or if it's not. So for example, if the user is not authenticated, right, it will show the user maybe you are not authenticated. That's 401 status code, if you still remember from when I talked about HTTP status code, right? And then if the user is not validated at all, it doesn't have the right to access that resource, or maybe their JWT expired, maybe we just show them the 403 status code. That is that they are forbidden from accessing that resource, right? So that's basically JSON Web Token in a nutshell, right? So now let's go back to our controller folder, and then let's continue working with what? Let's now work on the user module, right? So what I'm just going to do is use module.exports, right? Okay, it's supposed to be curly brackets, not. All right, so the first method I'm going to create is create user. That's the first method that's I'm going to create here. So it's going to be an asynchronous function, which is going to take in a request and a resource, right? A request and a resource, right? And then, so to verify if the user's email is correct, we are just going to use this email regex, right? You can just search on it on Stack Overflow or on the internet, right? Email regex, right? Like that. So I'm just getting squiggly lines. I don't know why I'm getting squiggly lines here. Okay. I think it's because we made a mistake. It's supposed to be square brackets. Right. All right. So now we are just going to check if email regex .test. We're just going to test request.body.email. So if it's not, then we are going to just show the user that the email that they entered is invalid, right? And then we will show them 400 status code email, invalid email, right? And then after this, the next thing that we need to do is create a variable for the minimum password. Minimum password length, which is equal to 8. That's the minimum password length, right? So what we are just going to do is we are going to check if the request.body.length is less than the minimum password. So if it's less than the minimum password, then we'll just show the user that they need to enter a password that has at least 8 characters, right? That is at least characters. All right, and then after that, what we just need to do is we just need to create a try catch block, right? A try catch block. So first thing, we need to check if the email exists. So I'll just say email exists, which is equal to await user dot find one, right? User dot find one. So if this email is found, that means that we already have an existing email in our database. So what we just do is we just tell the user that this email already exists, right? So if email exists, what we are just going to do, we are just going to return a response.status 400, right? .json, right? And then the status is going to be false, and then the message is going to be email already exists. Email already exists, right? And then the next, what we need to do is we need to encrypt the password, right? We need to encrypt the password because when we are dealing with password, that's sensitive information. So we need to make sure that when we are storing these passwords in our database, they're encrypted, right? So to encrypt the password, we'll just use the bcrypt.hash. So this hash, right? And then we'll just put in our password. And then what this value 10 value that to do is that when our password is encrypted, right, bcrypt is just going to add 10 additional values to our password so that no one can just guess what our password is, right? So now what we're just going to do, let's create a new user, which is going to be user, and then the username is supposed to be is equal to request.body.username, and then first name is going to be request.body.firstname, and then last name is supposed to be request.body.last name, and then we have email, which is request.body.email, and then we also have user type, which is equal to user by default, right? And then password, which is going to be equal to our encrypted password, like this, right? So after we are done with this, what we are just going to do is we need to just save this data in our database. So new user.save, right? And then after we have saved this database, what we are just going to do is we are just going to return a response.status with status code 201. So if you still remember when we talked about HTTP status code, I say that the 201 status code is the one that we use when we show that a resource has been created successfully, right? So we are still getting this red squiggly line is because we need to use a catch block to catch any error that might pop up on our application, right? So for example, we are just going to return a response.status, right? Response.status 500.json, and then the status is false, and then message error.message. Okay, so it's supposed to be, let's just say error.message. Okay, so that's it for our creating our user. And then we also need to log in your user, right? So login user, we'll create a method login user. So this is going to be an asynchronous method, request, response, and then how we try. So we also need to verify the user's email address. So I'm just going to paste the email regex that we did in there, and then also need to check the password length. Okay, so let me paste it again, password length right there. And then we need a try catch block, right? Try catch block. So user. So our user is equals to, if a user is equals to await user.find1 email request.body.email, right? So if, for example, if we don't have this user, right? So this means that this user does not exist or the user is not found, right? So we just say user not found. User not found. Right. And then what we're just going to do, if user, that means that we have our existing user, and await, right, bcrypt to compare. So now we are just comparing the passwords, right? So we are just going to compare the password that the user entered on our front end. So that's the requested body. That's the requested body dot password, and then we are just going to compare it to user dot password, right? So if they match, then that means that the user entered the correct password, right? And then what I'm just going to do, we are just going to create a user token. A user token. So to create a user token, we just use jwt.sign. So if you still remember, we talked about JWT signature. So it's just going to sign, right? We're just going to sign, and then we're just going to pass in the ID. So if you still remember, this ID is going to be in the payload, right? So this is going to be payload, and then also user type, which is going to be user dot user type, and then email, also email, which is going to be user dot email. Okay, so now we need to provide a key for us to sign our JWT. So it's going to be a secret key, process.env.jwt secret, and then we need to provide like the timeline in which our token expires. So our token is going to expire in 30 days, right? Let's just say 30 days, right? 30 days, right? So in this case, we didn't create the JWT secret key, right? So let's go inside our env folder, right? If you go inside our env folder, so I'm just going to create a variable JWT secret, which is equal to JWT secret, which is going to be equal to, let's just call it job search, right? So that's our JWT right there. All right. And then after we do that, what we just need to do is we just need to create a variable with this with the password, and then others, right, which is equal to user.doc. Okay, it's supposed to be underscore doc. That's going to be the user document, right? And then when the user logs in, we're going to just turn status code 200, right? Status code 200.json, right? And then we are going to pass in others, and then the user token. Okay, it's supposed to be 3 items, and then user token right there. Okay, so the reason why we use password and then others is that we have the password, we are destructuring, we have the password and then others. And then in this, if we get a successful response, right? If we get a successful response, what we are just going to do here is that we're just going to exclude the password. We are going to return everything else except the password and then the user token, because you don't want to send the user password as a request, right? In case someone just uses maybe brute force to try to break into your server, okay? And then after that, response.status 500.json, and then status is false, and then you need to pass in the message, which is going to be error.message. All right, so now we are done with creating our user controller. Now let's move on to the user auth route, right? So let's create user auth route.js. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to first get the router from Express. So we're just going to require Express, and then router like this. All right, and then we need the auth controller. So it's supposed to be user auth controller. User auth controller, right, is called to require. Controller. User auth controller. Okay, so now we need a router. So we're just going to say router dot post request. So if you still remember when I talked about HTTP method, that the post request, it allows us to create a resource on the server. In this case, register user, right? That's our router A, register user. And then I'm just going to say user auth controller dot create user. So yeah, it's supposed to be controller. So I made a mistake. This is supposed to go inside the controller, not the middle. It's supposed to go inside the controller, right? Controller / user controller. Okay, and then router dot post, right? And then we also need login user, right? So we need login user. It's going to be user controller dot login user, right? We are done with our router, right? So the router is always short. So let's move on to our server.js, right? So let's move inside our server.js. So inside our server.js, what we are just going to do is, inside our server.js, what we are just going to do is app.use, and then what we are simply going to do is we are going to use /API / and then auth. Now we need to import our auth route, right? Constant user auth route is equal to require. Routes, and then we are going to use user auth route, and then user auth route like this, right? So now we are done with our API. So let's try to run our API, and seems as if we are getting an error here. It says that it cannot find bcrypt.js. So I think we made an error when we installed bcrypt. It's supposed to be bcrypt.js, not bcrypt.js. Okay. All right. Let's try now. Okay. Router.use was a middleware function but got an object. All right, so I think there's an error with route. Okay, let me check what's causing the error. So it's saying that require constant route. So it's with route. It says that router requires a middleware function but got an object. So I think it might have to do with create a user, login user. Okay. So let's check the server.js user auth server.js. So server.js. Okay, let's try to run it again. Let's see. Okay, let me see what's causing this. Okay, I think I know what's going on here. The problem is that we didn't export our route, right? So I just figured out we didn't export our, so we need to module dot exports, right? It's equals to router. Because if you don't do that, it will see these other items as an object, right? So let's see. It's saying that router is not defined. Okay, so router. Okay, now let's run it. Okay, now our server is now running. So let's test our server to see if it's working, right? So let's just test it out to see if it's working. So right here I have job board, register, login user. So we have our body, and then let's try to register. Let's see. Yeah, user not found. Yeah, folks, this user we haven't registered, so the user does not exist, right? So yeah, let's put in another field here, username, and then it's going to be Ishones. Yeah, okay. So let's change this from login user to register user. Okay, it's supposed to be register user. Let's send it. Okay, it's telling us that password must be at least 8 characters long. Okay, that's good. 8, let's send it. User created successfully. Now you can see user is now created successfully. So let's just get rid of this. Okay, and then let's just change our URL to login user. It's saying that user token is not defined. Okay, so the problem is, like, I think inside our controller, let's go inside our user login user, right? It's saying that user token is not defined. Okay, so I think I see where the problem is. Okay, all right. So the problem is why it's not defined is that this item, it's supposed to be it's supposed to be inside our if statement, right? That's why it's not defined. So let's just put it inside our if statement like this. Right, so let's go back. Let's try to save. Our backend I think our backend should work now. Let's see. Okay, so not server.js. Let's try to not server.js. Okay, now our backend is now running. So let's try to log in. Yeah, you can see now our backend is working. We have the user ID, username, you can see email, and then phone number, user type, user, and then also have like user token. You can see this is the user token right here. So now we are going to work on the Json Web Token middleware. right?